Our top story this morning, hundreds of supporters of Brazil's far-right ex-president Jair Bolsonaro stormed into the Congress, the presidential palace and the Supreme Court. Brazilian President Lula da Silva has condemned it as a fascist attack. The protesters disputed the result of the 30th October election in which Lula da Silva beat Bolsonaro and emerged victorious. This comes after Brazil's former President Jair Bolsonaro accused Lula da Silva of potential election fraud.
E nós, inclusive, vamos descobrir quem são os financiadores desses vândalos que foram a Brasília. Nós vamos descobrir os financiadores e todos eles pagarão com a força da lei esse gesto de irresponsabilidade, esse gesto antidemocrático e esse gesto de vândalos e de fascistas.
Meanwhile, the police struggled to contain the mob in Brasilia. Tear gas was used to displace the supporters here, and the busloads of people were detained by police at the site. Local media reports say over 170 people have been detained so far. On the other hand, Bolsonaro took to Twitter to reject the claims related to the invasion by his successor. He wrote on his Twitter account that peaceful demonstrations were part of democracy, but that any invasion of public buildings crossed the line. A massive operation is still underway by the Brazilian security forces to evacuate the demonstrators from the palace. The security forces used riot police on horseback and shot water cannons and fired tear gas. The anti-government mob attack was condemned by world leaders, including US President Joe Biden, who called it outrageous. We're now being joined by James Neil Green, who is a professor of Brazilian history and culture at the Brown University. James Green is also a fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs and visiting professor in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he served as the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the Brown University from 2005 to 2008, also the director of the Brazil Initiative from 2012 to 2020. Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Now, how do you assess the current situation in Brazil?
Well, it's very serious. This is the most serious attack on Brazilian democracy since the military came to power in 1964. But I think democracy prevailed, even though the damages to the buildings of the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the presidential palace were significant, including very important rare art that was in these buildings. They're starting to arrest the protesters, the vandals, as President Lula called them, and I think they will be finding. There'll be thousands of arrests, I think, eventually.
Right. Now, election fraud is at the heart of this unrest. How do you see this unfolding in the days to come? What would you say are some of their demands?
Well, I think their demands are pretty unclear because they've been calling for the last 2 months for the military to intervene. And the U.S. government, which is very close to Brazil, has made it very clear that if the military does intervene and to try to overthrow the Lula government, the United States will cut off all economic and military aid. So basically, their movement is going to be a movement against the Lula government and its policies. And whereas in the first couple of weeks after the elections, it's normal for there to be tension between the market and the government's policies, I think everyone now is going to be focusing on the next few weeks about how to defend and secure democracy in Brazil.
Right. Of course. Also, how do you assess the basis of Bolsonaro's claims of election fraud here?
Well, I mean, I was a part of an international team of people who observed the elections. The elections are the most secure elections, I think, in Latin America. They're very efficient. We know the results within 2 or 3 hours of the final vote. And there's no credible claim whatsoever of election fraud. This is something he announced before the elections. Bolsonaro has a tendency to copy Donald Trump. And so he copied Donald Trump in announcing before the elections that the elections would be fraudulent and also mobilizing his supporters afterward to invade the president. In the case of Brazil, the three branches of government, but in the case of the United States Congress. And although Bolsonaro says he has nothing to do with this, for the last 4 years, he's been attacking the Supreme Court and calling on people to invade the Supreme Court in the past. So there's no question in people's minds that he's behind this whole thing.
Right, absolutely. That being said, do you think it would be fair to compare this incident to what happened on the 6th of January at the U.S. Capitol?
It's alarmingly too close, 2 years and 2 days from that event. The difference, I think, that the main differences were that Congress was not in session here, and so there were no people in the buildings, and so it was a Sunday, and so that made there wasn't as much violence against people. No one was killed or hurt, although there were attacks on police and some journalists. In the United States, there was a real threat that the invaders would have killed the vice president and some of the members of Congress, where that was not a threat here. On the other hand, the damage was far worse than anything that happened in the Capitol in the United States. As I mentioned earlier, destroying very, very valuable national heritage art from the modernist period of the 50s and 60s when Brazil was built. And so this is really shocking. It's been a really shock to the country. And so I think although 49% of the people voted for Bolsonaro in the last election, 51% for Lula, only won by 1.8%, 2 million votes, I think a lot of the people who voted for Bolsonaro are going to distance themselves now from the violence of his most radical supporters, and that will weaken Bolsonaro, I think.
All right. Professor Green, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast with your insights on this. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.